The great mathematician and metaphysician Alfred North Whitehead once stated that the safest characterization of Western philosophy was as a series of footnotes to Plato. Whitehead goes on to elaborate that by this he does not mean that Western philosophy merely consists of elaborations upon any of the supposed systems of thought which are often attributed to Plato's corpus of writings, but rather that all Western thought owes itself to the, quote, inexhaustible mine of suggestion found unsystematically scattered through them. Whitehead instead implies that it is the very fact that Plato inherited and synthesized a budding tradition of thought, which had yet to be ossified by systemization, which allowed for Plato's thought to be such an endless reserve of inspiration. Looking beyond Plato himself and into the branching and vibrant growths of Western tradition, we indeed find that the traditions of Stoicism, Aristotelianism, and the aptly dubbed Neoplatonists all drew from this same wellspring of thought which gave coherent form to the Greek and Roman life worlds. Yet one of the most significant offspring of Plato would arrive just as the classical Hellenistic civilization began to cross over into the downward slope of its titanic life cycle. The birth of Christianity was undoubtedly an event of almost incomprehensibly immense, world-making and world-unmaking proportions. As the sprawling and diverging shoots of Platonism came to merge with those of Semitic monotheism, this merger thereby gave rise to spiritual, institutional, artistic, and literary forms which continue to shape and reshape our world, Western or otherwise, even into the present day. With Christianity, we see the first of what I take to be three fundamental transmutations which the Platonic tradition has undergone throughout the course of its development. Christianity was, among so many other things, a merger of Platonic transcendentalism and the immanence of Semitic monotheism, a merger with ramifications which cannot possibly be overstated. Even as our civilization seems to be undergoing a process of shrugging off our Christian heritage, it is nevertheless the case that the world we Westerners currently inhabit is one which has been generated by Christianity and its implications. Insofar as our civilization is a product of Christianity, so too is it a product of Platonism. So perhaps then there truly is nothing new under the Neoplatonic sun under which we find ourselves. Even the most ostensibly anti-Platonic of Western philosophers, such as Nietzsche, Heidegger, or Wittgenstein, seem only ever able to invert, mutate, rearrange, or turn inside out the Platonic heritage which they seem to so often desperately wish to annul or disavow. This might seem like a rather dismal view, fantastical as it may indeed seem, yet we should remind ourselves that all life on Earth also shares such a common ancestry. Yet, nonetheless, even as we all may be the children of some primordial prion or strand of proto-RNA, our deeply rooted commonality and mutual entanglement in no way precludes novelty, and this is as much the case for biological life as it is for the endeavors of human thought. Indeed, it can be said that true novelty requires restraint and structure, as many artists will be quick to affirm. Radical novelty rarely emerges fully formed from the void, and as the emergence of Christianity illustrates, as the merger of Platonic and Abrahamic metaphysics, it seems rather to be that the most truly consequential rupturings of novelty result instead from synthesis, cross-pollination, and symbiosis. If the emergence of Christianity represents the first epochal metamorphosis of Western philosophy, then the second came with the thought of René Descartes. Just as Christianity merged the immanent divinity of Abrahamic monotheism with Platonic transcendentalism, so Descartes reconstructed Western metaphysics such that a dynamic interplay of doubt, certainty, mathematical precision, and ontological self-assurance would become the foundations of the modern sciences. With Descartes, the very ground beneath Western thought came to shift. Individual ego rationality came to be the fundamental arbiter of truth and certainty. The Christian church and faith were no longer needed as arbiters of truth, and human beings henceforth became radically free to discern truth through their own reason, unbounded by the received wisdom of the past or of church authority. If the birth of Christianity was a process of metaphysical symbiosis, then Cartesianism should perhaps be understood as a process of metaphysical contraction. As the Copernican Revolution and Protestant Reformation destabilized and fractured the life world of Christendom, such that it could no longer serve as a secure and stable foundation for the human soul, Descartes turned inward, relocating the foundations of metaphysics within his own capacity to doubt, discern, question, and scrutinize. Rationality came to be understood as that which achieves certainty through dissection and measurement, and nature was understood then to be that which is dissectable and measurable. That is to say, that which the secure and stable self-certainty of ego rationality is able to render secure and stable. Descartes disentangled mind from matter, and thereby matter could be regarded as that which was beholden to objective, mechanistic laws which dictated events in the world independently of conscious agency. The world came to be regarded as consisting of extension and automata, and the conditions for the possibility of modern science were thus instantiated. A process was set in motion through which the world would be de-animated and unworlded. Yet through this same process, foundations were laid which conditioned the possibility of the individual human soul achieving a kind of freedom which was previously unthinkable as well as impossible. With this channel, however, I would like to focus upon what I take to be the third major transformation of Western philosophy, one which I feel has rarely received the attention which it deserves, at least in terms of its metaphysical and indeed spiritual significance. A rupturing forth of a novelty which Western thought has yet to truly integrate within the bounds of its Platonic heritage, and which contains within it vast depths of potentiality which have yet to fully unfold. As one truculent descendant of Plato once told us, even the lights of the stars take time, and this momentous event, if any, is still very much wandering. Evolution is such a mischievously beautiful little word. It radiates an aura of scientific prestige and power, like a herald of a glorious, glimmering future, yet remaining in some sense subversive, rebellious, poised to rob us of whatever simplistic dogmas with which we might reassure ourselves regarding our place within the vast, mysterious, and unfathomable reality which we inhabit. The physicalist philosopher of mind, Daniel Dennett, has referred to Darwinian evolution as a universal acid, eating through and transmuting whatever preconceived paradigms it contacts. The elegantly simple thought of evolution sits quietly like a glowing hot ember within the philosophical vocabulary arsenals of modern thought, ready to bestow vitalizing ignition or annihilating incineration within whatever constellations of thought it might be introduced to. When we think of evolution, our minds tend to turn first and foremost to Darwin, to his utterly groundbreaking, yet, as we shall see, profoundly incomplete insight that the breathtaking design and embodied intelligence of nature could be, in fact, self-creating, sculpted not directly by the conscious workings of a supernatural artificer, but rather by the slow, methodical, yet limitlessly creative powers of mutation, selection, and the will to being. There's certainly much to be said about Darwin, both with regards to the innumerable implications, elaborations, and consequences of his thought, as well as with regards to the various ways in which Darwin's conception of evolution as natural selection and its neo-Darwinian successor theories may prove to have been oversimplified, mal-emphasized, or incomplete. I very much intend to return to the topic of Darwinian natural selection in the near future, but for now, I intend instead to direct our attention elsewhere, towards figures who are rarely given attention within discussions pertaining to evolutionary thinking, but who I believe to have been of immense and essential consequence. But first, I would like us to examine, very generally, the history of evolutionary thought, in order to suggest reasons why evolutionary ideas seem to be so at odds with the basic premises of Western metaphysics, and thus why the integration of such notions is of such tremendous consequence. In a passage discussing the possibility of anti-Hegelian philosophical thought, the French post-buzzword thinker Michel Foucault stated that, quote, "We have to determine the extent to which our anti-Hegelianism is possibly one of Hegel's tricks directed against us, at the end of which he stands motionless, waiting for us." End quote. Although I don't intend to examine either Foucault or Hegel here, I nevertheless find this quote to be pertinent, as whenever I think about it, I always think to myself that Foucault may very well have said the exact same statement regarding Plato, as indeed it seems that we find, no matter how far and restlessly we wander, that Plato himself stands upon the shores where our long roads finally encounter the sea. It is almost as though Plato meticulously designed the rules of the philosophical games which we set out to play in advance, with a prescient understanding of all the possible ways in which one might create strategies of thinking within the bounds of reason which he gave shape to. Yet despite all such quasi-oracular insight, there seems to be at least one shore upon which we do not find Plato to be waiting for us with a knowing smile. If we plot out the history of evolutionary thinking as a whole, we find ourselves upon such a shoreline. In his Timaeus, Plato's interlocutors discuss the history of the world and in doing so present us with a cosmogonic mythos by which the world is said to have been created by a kind of proto-trinitarian pantheon of the One, signifying ultimate, infinite, eternal perfection, the Demiurge, or the divine agency which created the world, and the Anima Mundi, or the world's soul. As such, the Timaeus implies that our world is ever in a state of decay, in a sense falling ever downward or away from the timeless divinity from which it emerged. This conception of time and of world history seems to have been a central theme of Greek culture, as it can be seen to predate even Plato himself. In Hesiod's didactic poem Works and Days, we are told that the history of humanity has been one of gradual yet inevitable decay. Human history begins with a golden age of primal unity with nature, abundance, and prosperity, in which humanity was not yet burdened and tormented by want and hardship, instead living simply and peacefully by reaping the bounty of the world's natural fecundity. The Golden Age is then followed by an age of silver, an age of bronze, a heroic age, and finally an age of iron, the age in which the events of Hesiod's works and days are said to occur. This narrative of history, much like the cosmological narrative of the Timaeus, or indeed the narrative of humanity's fall from Eden, is one of decline and decay, as human civilization finds itself falling ever farther away from its original state of primal harmony and further into decadence, hardship, and scarcity. Yet even in the ancient world, we can find the seeds of a rather different conception of time, one in which time is not regarded as necessarily a force of destruction and disintegration, but rather instead as a creative force, or indeed the very instrument of creation itself. Indeed, even in Hesiod's own theogony, we find a cosmogony which seems radically distinct from that of the Timaeus in its implications regarding the nature of time. Within the theogony, we are told that the world began not with a state of timeless, infinite perfection, but rather with the primordial chaos which precedes all other being. After chaos was born Gaia, said to be the foundation of all, representing perhaps corporeal reality itself as something distinct from formless void. From these two primordial beings, other deities then come forth. Eros, the will to life and sensuality, Erebus, or darkness, and Nyx, the night. Erebus and Nyx then copulated, giving birth to ether, or light, and Hemera, or day, while Gaia gave birth in an apparently parthenogenic manner to Uranus, the sky, Aurea, the mountains, and Pontus, the sea. In this cosmogony, time is not regarded as a gradual falling away from a state of primordial perfection, but rather it is through time that the becoming and interweaving of divine powers gives rise to novelty, diversity, and life itself from a state of ultimate formlessness. Time is seen to be a force of creative power rather than of increasing distance from a timeless and eternal divinity. Time is understood as Eros as much as Thanatos. Despite the presence of this understanding of time as creative power within ancient mythocosmology, and despite similar proto-evolutionary conceptions being advanced by the Greek atomists, it would nevertheless be the mythos of time as decay and timelessness as perfection which came to dominate the Western imagination up to the very recent past. It seems to me that the reason for this downplay or erasure of creative time, and thus of proto-evolutionary concepts, resulted from a duality which lies at the very core of Western philosophy: the duality of being and becoming. Throughout the vast majority of classical Western thought, with notable exceptions such as the Greek atomists or Heraclitus, being and becoming were understood oppositionally, as concepts which were defined primarily as the negations of one another. Being was considered to precondition becoming, with the former being more ontologically fundamental than the latter, which was considered to be somehow derivative or impure. Being is that which is stable in reality, that which underlies beings and thereby allows for continuity of identity in spite of the tumultuous fluctuations of becoming. Although, for example, a person may change throughout their lifetime, much like the proverbial ship of Theseus, the person nevertheless maintains a stable identity insofar as their being, whatever that might be understood to be, constitutes an unchanging foundation which is not destroyed by temporal alterations. Moving from Platonic to Christian notions, one might say that a person's being is their eternal soul, whereas a person's becoming pertains only to the body. This fundamental duality and its asymmetry has been given expression throughout innumerable notions within Western thought. Soul over body, eternality over temporality, heaven over earth, light over darkness, the infinite over the finite, transcendence over immanence. We can perhaps understand this fundamental opposition more clearly by contrasting it with certain non-Western conceptions of ontology, such as the ancient Chinese notion of Tao. It has been said that just as being is the most central notion within all of Western philosophy, similarly Tao might be considered as the most central notion within many forms of Chinese philosophy. Tao, unlike the Platonic understanding of being, is a notion which does not imply static, inalterable atemporality, but rather denotes something more akin to process or way. It is not a static lack of alteration which is distinct from or opposed to becoming, but rather can be understood as a modality of becoming, a notion which contains temporality and flux within itself, rather than being defined in opposition to them. Form can thus be seen not as that which is devoid of imperfection and thus devoid of time, but rather as that which gives shape to time. Form can be understood as transcending temporally situated events or entities, while nonetheless being ontologically codependent upon and co-conditioning of the temporal realm of becoming. As we will come to see, one of the most significant transformations of Western thought since the times of our Hellenic forebears has been the transition from an ontology grounded in substance to an ontology grounded in process. A transformation which we will see in much greater detail once we come to examine the process-relational ontology of Alfred North Whitehead. Such an ontological transmutation is able to retain the philosophical achievements of the Western tradition while synthesizing it with non-Western insights in such a way that previously occluded paths forward are revealed, and also such that new light can be cast upon the past of Western tradition, revealing it in surprising and invigorating ways. This radical transition, championed most notably by Whitehead, would prove to have implications of tremendous significance and would give birth to an entire microcosm within Western thought, which we now regard as the beautifully polychromatic realm of process philosophy, a realm which we will certainly be exploring in great detail along the course of our journey. Although a fully rigorous examination of being or Tao would be far beyond the scope of this preliminary overview, for my present purposes, this comparison hopefully brings into focus what I see as a fundamental tension within Western ontology, and consequently within Western metaphysics as a whole. The Western mind achieved its greatest triumphs through looking to the heavens, and thus to a world which seemed to be above and beyond the realm of time and change which we inhabit. Yet this valuation of eternality, perfection, and infinitude created limits which evolutionary thinking would come to pierce and sunder, demanding that Western minds reconstitute some of the most basic axioms of the entire endeavor of Western reason while wrenching open the doors to immensely novel ways of understanding life, the cosmos, the standing of human existence within the diversity of nature, and even the nature of divinity. The story which I wish to tell here is the story of the re-emergence of creative time within Western philosophy. The story of how the series of footnotes to Plato has come to be an evolutionary rather than eternalist Neoplatonism, and how this re-territorialization of the relationship between being and becoming came to metamorphize Western metaphysics. Evolutionary thinking has often been regarded as representing a radical break from the foundational metaphysics of our Platonic heritage, but here I will be challenging that narrative, as I believe that we can instead see the emergence of creative time not as an annulment of the Western tradition, but rather as the opening up of a new dimension within the lineage of thought and consciousness within which we inextricably find ourselves. As I have already mentioned, there is certainly much to be said here of Darwinism, which is a subject to which I do intend to return in due course. However, in my effort to understand how evolutionary thought has come to synthesize with and transmute Western metaphysics, I will instead be looking to a number of much less well-renowned thinkers, who I see as having provided the Western philosophic tradition with seminal developments which have yet to fully germinate, and which Western intellectual culture has yet to seriously contend with. This diverse motley of brilliant minds, whose contributions I will attempt to weave together into this narrative, will include thinkers such as the Swiss philosopher, linguist, and poet Jean Gebser, the French Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin, the French philosopher of time and freedom Henri Bergson, the German Renaissance man Johann von Goethe, the German theocosmologist Friedrich Schelling, the British mathematician and analytic metaphysician Alfred North Whitehead, the American physicist and engineer Arthur Young, and the British rebel biologist Rupert Sheldrake. Undoubtedly, many other figures will make their way onto the stage as I progress in elucidating this narrative, and this project is intended to be as much an effort of exploration and adventure as much as it may be one of exposition and exegesis. I should be perfectly clear in advance that I am not an expert. I am not a historian of philosophy, and in fact, I am not a professional academic of any kind. With that said, I will certainly be making mistakes along the way, but I do very much intend for this effort to be one which holds to the intellectual ideals of rigor, depth, detail, and clarity. I will be beginning this journey with a series of videos dedicated to an exploration of Jean Gebser's magnum opus, The Ever-Present Origin, as Gebser's conceptions of the structures of human consciousness and of the futures of human consciousness are focused heavily upon the relationships between consciousness and time. The ever-present origin itself demonstrates the ways in which consciousness of creative time allow us to see the history of humanity in radically novel ways. And Gebser's analysis closely examines the ways in which time consciousness has mutated throughout its various historical unfoldings. Gebser's narrative begins with the primordial beginnings of humanity and guides us through a series of developments which brings us to our own contemporary world, in which Gebser sees the emergence of an entirely new modality of human consciousness, characterized by the emergence of a novel relationship between time and human beings, what he calls the integral consciousness structure. Yet unlike many other evolutionary accounts of human consciousness, Gebser's narrative is very far from a blunt, mechanical reductivism. Quite to the contrary, Gebser instead sees the emergence of the integral as in fact the emerging of a capacity within human beings to truly cognize and engage with spirit, and thus with what he sees as the fundamentally diaphanous nature of reality. If you've made it this far, then I hope that you'll stick around as I attempt to delve into these various rabbit holes and weave their various riches into a cohesive conception of where we are, how we arrived here, and where we may be going. I'm not currently able to adhere to a rigorous upload schedule, but I plan to strive for getting at least one video posted each week. In addition to the videos in which I examine and commentate upon the material, I will also be creating audiobook style recordings of specific chapters or sections along the way. All of my work here will be accompanied by music, all of which I create myself, and I plan on creating a playlist containing extended versions of my ambient pieces so that they can be listened to without any overdubbed dialogue. With all that said, I would be very much appreciative of any likes, subscribes, or comments, as doing so will help tremendously in bringing more voices into this conversation, and thereby furthering the depth and richness of this journey. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.